Welcome to the 1990s, ladies and gentlemen. Yes, we are going to be covering the 1990s today. This is a decade that is near and dear to my own heart. As we look at the 1990s, just for some little bit of personal perspective before we dig into the history, the 1990s is the decade when I graduated from high school, met Beth, graduated from college, went to China on my first foreign missions trip, and married Beth. So in 1990, I turned 16. In 1991, I graduated. In 1994, I was 20 and met Beth. In 96, I graduated from college, and in 98, we were married. So kind of a big decade for me personally. So I remember all this stuff that we're talking about today really well. I remember most of it from the 80s too, but all of this I remember very well as I was basically your age or older throughout this decade. So, the 1990s. There's a lot we could cover. There was a lot of stuff going on in pop culture. Really, the 1990s saw the launch of the internet, which was probably the single biggest pop culture thing that transformed the world. Of course, it was dial-up internet in the 1990s, and you had to sort of wait for it to connect, and then it was a really slow connection, but it was transformative to American life. America Online, AOL, was the dominant internet service provider in America. Yahoo was the dominant search engine. So You've Got Mail. If you've never seen the rom-com, the romantic comedy starring Tom Hanks and Meg Ryan called You've Got Mail, that would be a good one to watch. It's kind of a modern interpretation of Pride and Prejudice. So if you love Pride and Prejudice, it's got value for that. But also it'll give you a little bit of a snapshot into life in the earlier internet days of the 1990s. But we're not going to talk about the internet. We're not going to talk much pop culture. You had grunge music and Nirvana and Pearl Jam and Red Hot Chili Peppers, and Blink-182 came on the scene, and Will Smith was really big, and all of these things that we're not going to talk about. And you might think, oh, come on, Mr. Van Bell, that is just boring that we're not going to talk about the fun stuff. Well, there's only so much time we have, and there were some important things that happened in the 1990s that we need to cover. Not that those things aren't important. Jurassic Park movies, The Lion King, you can see the screen in front of you, all these iconic images and things from the 1990s. But this is a decade, the decade of my entering adulthood and marriage, but also a decade of big change for America and for the world. So, I said Blink-182, and Andrew got his interest piqued over there. And he started saying, what is he talking about in there? Red Hot Chili Peppers, too. Andrew likes the music of the late 1990s. I don't know why. It's better than today's music, I suppose, but I'm biased. All right, let's jump into class. We're going to start, actually not yet in the 1990s, but we're going to start in 1988. And I apologize that my face is blocking part of this slide, but the 1988 presidential election is where we're going to start because this is the end of the Reagan era and the beginning of George H.W. Bush's presidency. So I was 14 years old during this election. I remember it. We were living in Virginia. Yeah. By that year, we were living in Virginia. And George H.W. Bush, or Bush 41, or Bush the Elder, he was elected president in a pretty decisive victory over Michael Dukakis, George H.W. Bush had been President Reagan's vice president for 8 years, and this was very much viewed by most of the American people as wanting a third term of Reagan. Reagan left office as the most popular president in terms of when he left office. I think he had a 68% approval rating. That's the highest approval rating of any outgoing president in U.S. history since they started doing approval polls. So Bush won a pretty decisive victory. He won 53.4% of the popular vote versus Michael Dukakis's 50 or 45% of the popular vote. So a popular vote margin of victory of some 7 million votes, carried 40 out of the 50 states, got 426 electoral college votes, carried California. He would be one of the last Republicans to carry California. Really pretty overwhelming victory. But people found out that George H.W. Bush wasn't the same kind of president as Ronald Reagan. He was a decent man, a good president, but he got in trouble because he broke a big campaign promise. And that is during this presidential election, 1988. He was asked, because people knew he wasn't quite as conservative as Reagan, and so they wanted to know, basically, where do you stand on taxes? And so he made it a big campaign speech during this campaign, and the line was, "Read my lips, no new taxes." He said, hey, because the Democrats were in control of the House of Representatives, which they had been for a long time. And so that's where all revenue bills, tax bills generate. Remember that from back at the beginning of the class when we talked about the framework of the government? All revenue bills, all tax bills originate from the House of Representatives, and the Democrats were in control of the House of Representatives. So Bush was asked basically, hey, if the Democrats in the House of Representatives come up with a tax hike, what are you going to say? And he's going to say, no new taxes, no new taxes. Read my lips, no new taxes. Well, during his term, President Bush signed into law a very large tax increase. So he did raise taxes after he said he wouldn't. Now, it came after a government shutdown. The Democrats in the House refused to fund the government. The government got shut down. It was a bad time. So that was his why he lost re-election, probably due to that breaking of that promise not to raise taxes. But let's look at the most important events of the 1990s. We begin, these first two are during President Bush's presidency. I'm going to talk about some of these as individual slides, individual close-ups, and some of these I'm just going to talk about now. But these are the most important events of the 1990s. In 1991, there was a Gulf War, the first Gulf War, Operation Desert Shield and Storm. This was the defense of Saudi Arabia and the liberation of Kuwait from Saddam Hussein and Iraq. This happened during my senior year of high school. I remember it very well. My dad was in the military. We lived on a military base. And it was the first war to be carried live on CNN. CNN was the 24-hour-a-day cable news network then. There was no Fox News or MSNBC. It was only CNN. And they broadcast this war live into our homes. And that was radical during my senior year of high school. And then the following year, the Los Angeles riots happened in response to the Rodney King beating. So I'm not going to talk about this later. I'll talk about it now. Rodney King was an African-American man who was pulled over by the police. And he was very obviously high on drugs, intoxicated, out of control, belligerent, aggressive. And the cops beat him pretty badly. They beat him into submission. Even after they got him on the ground, they kept hitting him with their nightsticks, kicking him, and this was caught on video. So this was kind of the first major event of the news where you had like just a citizen caught something on video, and it was on the evening news, and it was a big scandal. These guys were obviously beating this man. Well, it went to trial, and the cops were not convicted. They got off. And when they got off, there were riots. So you guys are probably familiar with the Black Lives Matter movement of more recent years. This was sort of an early incarnation of that. This was a, hey, how come this guy Rodney King could get beaten by cops, caught on video, and they're not convicted? Obviously, they were white cops. He was black, so it became a whole racial thing. And the Los Angeles riots erupted, and it was terrible. There were beatings. There was a white truck driver who happened to be pulling through the area at the time, and they pulled him out of his truck and they beat him senseless for no reason other than the fact that he was white and a truck driver. And so it was very racial. It was very violent. And Rodney King, a very famous line, Rodney King came on television during the riots and said, "Can't we all just get along?" And so that's kind of a line you may have heard. Can't we all just get along? That was Rodney King in response to the Los Angeles riots. Then in 1992, Bill Clinton is elected president. And so he serves 2 terms as president. So most of the 90s are Bill Clinton's presidency. That's Hillary's husband. The first World Trade Center bombing happened in 1993. I'm not going to talk much about this today either, but this was the Blind Sheikh. This was an Islamic sheikh who orchestrated a bombing of the World Trade Center, the Twin Towers. Again, this is 8 years before they would come down in 2001, which we're going to talk about next class on 9/11. But the first World Trade Center bombing did kill some people. It was an underground parking garage. It was not successful. It was supposed to blow up the whole World Trade Center, but it was not really successful in the fact that it didn't blow up the whole World Trade Center, obviously, but there were people killed, and the sheikh responsible was arrested. And this was sort of a domestic attack by Islamic terrorists, and it was an early one. So this was one of the early attacks, domestic U.S. attack from Islamic terrorists. All right. In 1993, we saw the Branch Davidians standoff in Waco, Texas, and then in response to that, 2 years later, the Oklahoma City bombing. We are going to talk about that. 1994, the NAFTA Free Trade Agreement, North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA. This basically opened up the trade borders between Canada, U.S., and Mexico and allowed for free trade. And the net effect of this was that in the late 1990s, early 2000s, a lot of U.S. manufacturing jobs went to Mexico. Ross Perot, who had run for president in 1992, we're going to talk about that in a little bit. Ross Perot had run for president in 92. He went on CNN, very famously, he went on Larry King and debated Al Gore, who was Bill Clinton's vice president and the lead negotiator for NAFTA. And he said there's a giant sucking sound of jobs being pulled out of America into Mexico. We lived for a couple of years in a small town in South Carolina called Cheraw, and Cheraw lost a bunch of jobs, manufacturing jobs, to NAFTA. They went to Mexico. So it really did have an impact in that way. And it was this was actually part of President Trump's popularity, is a lot of people who lost their manufacturing jobs due to NAFTA in the 90s voted for Trump in 2016 on the promise that he was going to restore manufacturing jobs to America. 94-95 was the Republican Revolution. Republicans led by Newt Gingrich gained control of the House of Representatives for the first time in 40 years. And then in 96, the Summer Olympic Games were held in Atlanta. It was a very successful Olympic Games for America, the host country, but there was also an Olympic Park bombing that took place during that time, and a lot of controversy over trying to find out who did it, and falsely accusing Richard Jewell and all that. And then in 1998, we're not going to talk about this much either, but there were 2 U.S. embassy bombings in Tanzania and in Kenya. U.S. embassies in Tanzania and Kenya were bombed by Islamic extremists, and hundreds of people were killed. And there wasn't really that much of a response from President Clinton. There wasn't really that much of a response. And this was, this was early Al-Qaeda terrorism. So Al-Qaeda would be the ones to carry off the 9/11 terrorist attack just 3 years later. So many people would look back on this and criticize President Clinton and say, well, he didn't really respond very strongly to these embassy bombings in Tanzania and Kenya. And as a result of that, that just emboldened and strengthened al-Qaeda and led to the 9/11 terrorist attacks. You can draw a connection there between those things. Also in 98, President Clinton faced impeachment and a trial in the Senate. And we'll talk about that at the end of class today. So those are the major events of the 1990s. Let's go ahead and go through some of them. So the first Gulf War was in 1990 to 91. And again, this was my senior year of high school. I graduated from high school in 1991. Not that you really care, but just telling you sort of where I was and how I remember this. So I was a senior in high school during this war, and we were living on a military base. My dad was active duty Air Force, had been in the Air Force since 1967, 68. So August 2nd, 1990, right before my senior year of high school began, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. So Iraq invaded Kuwait and basically rolled right over it. Took over, no time flat, no problem. And then he was stationed right at the border to Saudi Arabia. And many people thought he was going to go ahead and take over Saudi Arabia. And if Saddam Hussein had taken control of Iraq, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia, he would have controlled the majority of the world's oil supply. And he would have been so powerful and so rich. And he was a bad guy. So the decision was made that he needed to be stopped. There was a UN Security Council resolution to condemn his action and to impose economic sanctions, and that passed overwhelmingly. However, the United Nations would not fully authorize war to force Iraq out of Kuwait. So the US and the UK together, so this was President George H.W. Bush and Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher of the UK, they got together and they started forming a coalition. Canada, Australia, Germany, several other countries. And so it was an international coalition, not officially under the United Nations, but kind of under NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, but sort of bigger than that too. And it went, they put troops in Saudi Arabia at first to protect Saudi Arabia. And that was called Operation Desert Shield. So from August till the end of 1990, during that whole fall of 1990, Operation Desert Shield was just this massive accumulation of U.S. and international coalition firepower. The U.S. military was huge at the time. It was much larger then than it is now, believe it or not. In 1990, we had a much larger military then than we did now. President Clinton would downsize the U.S. military during his time in office. But this was right at the end of the Cold War. The Reagan buildup of the military had fully taken effect, and so we had a massive and dominant military. We lined up, we protected Saudi Arabia, and then in January of 1991, the liberation of Kuwait began with bombing. There was just a massive bombing campaign that took place for about a month, from January into February. And then, February 24th, 1991, there was the ground assault. The tanks started rolling in and basically met very little opposition because the bombing campaign had been so effective and the display of force from the coalition was so overwhelming. There were 292 total coalition soldiers who died. Half of those were killed by friendly fire. This is where I started hearing this new term, friendly fire. And that was where troops were accidentally killed by their own allies. Again, you had different countries coordinating together. Tanks were moving at high rate of speed. The enemy was melting away very rapidly. And so sometimes someone would get in your line of fire who was actually your ally and not the enemy. So 292 coalition deaths. About 150 of those were from Iraqi forces, and about 150 of those were from our own forces. 25,000 to 50,000 Iraqi deaths. I mean, that's a stunning, lopsided battle. So it was a very swift and decisive victory for the Allied coalition. And at the end of this war, President Bush had a 91% approval rating. So in March of 1991, President Bush had a 91% approval rating. It's the highest approval rating that has ever been recorded for any sitting U.S. president. And yet he would lose re-election the next year, which is why sometimes you can't put too much stock into approval ratings, because everybody was on a great high after we won this war. Everybody felt so proud to be Americans, and we had, saved Kuwait. We had defeated the enemy. This war was, like I said earlier, it was broadcast live on CNN. And there were also smart bombs with laser-guided precision. So this image that's in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen is something that we would see on television. Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld would give these briefings where he would show these videos of these smart bombs that would target exactly where they wanted to go. And anyway, it was pretty cool. And so it wasn't Donald Rumsfeld. I forget who it was. But anyway, Dick Cheney, I think it was. Anyway, so we had just overwhelming victory. That was the first Gulf War. And then there was a presidential election. It was a very strange presidential election in American history, in that it really was a three-way race in 1992. You had the Republican, you had the Democrat, and then you had an independent, H. Ross Perot, from Texas, same state as George H.W. Bush. Ross Perot was an independent. He was pretty conservative, but he was an independent and he didn't like Bush. There's a long-standing animosity between the Bush family and the Perot family in Texas. So Ross Perot did not want to see Bush get reelected, and so he drew away a lot of conservative votes who were upset with George H.W. Bush for raising taxes. Remember, he broke his promise, read my lips, no new taxes. And Ross Perot really capitalized on that. Ross Perot also, he bought television time, like half-hour blocks of television time. And he would come on and he would give these in-depth presentations of what he would do. So anyway, he got almost 20% of the vote. He got 18.9% of the vote. By far the most successful third-party candidate in the last 100 years since Teddy Roosevelt. And he didn't get any electoral college votes. But if you look at this, like Georgia went for Bill Clinton, Tennessee went for Bill Clinton, Louisiana went for Bill Clinton, Missouri, Kentucky went for Bill Clinton. Those are all states that would typically be Republican states. And so it was a pretty decisive electoral college victory for Bill Clinton, but he only got 43% of the vote. That is lower. That is a lower percentage of the vote than Michael Dukakis got when he lost in 1998. You see that? 1998, Michael Dukakis got 45.6% of the vote and lost in a landslide. Like that's not a lot of vote. And in 1992, Bill Clinton got 43.9% of the vote, even less of the vote. See that? So Bill Clinton was elected president with the smallest number of popular votes and the lowest percentage of the popular vote of anyone in a long time. But he became president. And one of the things he promised was a middle-class tax cut. So he made a promise that he was going to cut taxes for the middle class. And so that left Ross Perot and Bill Clinton as both promising tax cuts, and George H.W. Bush as the man who had promised not to raise taxes, but then had raised taxes. All right, 1993. This is these two events together represent the most significant act of domestic terrorism by sort of right-wing, and I use that term loosely, nationalist, anti-government people. And you got to get the whole story to understand what happened. So in 1993, there was a guy named David Koresh who had a cult in Waco, Texas, called the Branch Davidians. They were an offshoot from Seventh-day Adventists. They were extremists. They were strange. David Koresh held everybody spellbound in this cult on this compound just outside of Waco, Texas. And there was concern from the FBI because there were reports from people who had escaped the Branch Davidians and told them what was going on, that David Koresh was sleeping with girls, that he had taken teenage girls as his mistresses. He was sexually abusing teenage girls. And there were other things going on, brainwashing and behavior control. So it was a cult, and they were also stockpiling weapons, was the report. And they were kind of a doomsday cult in that they were expecting the end of the world, and so they were stockpiling weapons. Well, Clinton had become president, and he sent in the FBI, and they surrounded the compound, and then they moved in. They moved in to try to liberate the compound, to try to capture David Koresh after a multiple day standoff. And the compound caught fire. It was probably a fire set by the Branch Davidians, who would rather die than surrender to the FBI. But right-wing radical groups who hated Clinton, hated the FBI, hated the government, they interpreted that as the FBI firebombed this compound of civilians and killed all these innocent children. Again, the compound was almost certainly set ablaze by the Branch Davidians themselves when they saw the FBI coming in and they didn't want to surrender. 2 years later, on the 2-year anniversary of the Branch Davidian compound collapse, Timothy McVeigh drove a truck loaded with homemade explosives, like a big delivery truck that was loaded with fertilizer, diesel fuel, like a huge, basically turned the truck into a bomb. Parked it in the underground parking garage of the Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, and then left. And he set off the bomb. He was not there. And it killed 168 people and injured 680. And you can see the picture there. It completely destroyed this federal building. This is what, by the way, this is what the blind sheikh was trying to do to the World Trade Center, but wasn't successful. Timothy McVeigh was successful. This is right-wing domestic terrorism. So this and the Olympic Park bombing I'm going to talk to you about later, these are why there is concern from many people on the left about right-wing domestic terrorism, and why they say that many people on the radical right, the alt-right, the sort of white nationalist right-wing, and I don't even like calling those people right-wing because it's not really conservatism, it's more of a racist white nationalism, and that's Timothy McVeigh was a racist white nationalist, and so was David Koresh. That these people are dangerous, and this is the evidence that these people are dangerous. Timothy McVeigh was later convicted. He later was executed, the death penalty. But this is the single worst act of domestic terrorism in the sense that an American citizen attacked an American target. 9/11 was really an international terrorist plot from Al-Qaeda. Next year, after the Branch Davidians, 1994, the Republican Revolution happened. So this was a unique thing. Newt Gingrich, who was the leader of the Republicans in the House of Representatives, organized all the Republican candidates for House offices into a national campaign and came up with a thing called the Contract with America. And the Contract with America was a promise from these Republicans that said, if you will give us control of the House of Representatives, we promise that within the first 100 days, we will bring up a vote on these 10 issues. And it was things like a balanced budget amendment, welfare reform, prayer in public schools, school choice, things like that. This was called the Contract with America. It was a very successful campaign. Also, it was successful because President Clinton had run for office. He had run for president as a moderate. He had been the governor of Arkansas. He said he would cut taxes for the middle class, and he promised to be a moderate Southern Democrat. Then he got into office, and almost immediately he put Hillary Clinton, his wife, in charge of a healthcare task force that came up with a proposal to nationalize the U.S. healthcare system under government control. It was known as Hillary Care. Long before Obamacare, we had Hillary Care. That was hugely unpopular with the American people, who did not want to see their health care in the hands of the government. And also, he raised taxes. He passed the largest tax increase in American history after promising to cut taxes. And no one forced him to do it. He just did it because that's what he wanted to do. So rather than cut taxes, he raised them significantly. And so this played into the Republicans' hand. The Republicans won. It was an overwhelming victory for the Republicans, and they got control of the House of Representatives for the first time in 40 years. This was also a time when I started paying attention. I was about 20 years old at this time. I started paying attention to the fact that the media was very biased in their coverage of national political things, because I would watch C-SPAN. Yes, I was a nerd. I would watch C-SPAN, or I would watch something else, and I would watch Newt Gingrich give a speech. And then I would watch CNN, or I would see Time Magazine cover that speech. And I thought, did they watch the same speech I watched? Because the speech I watched, the guy was very positive. He was very happy. He had good ideas. He had positive things he wanted to do for the country. He was very intelligent. He's very articulate. And they came on, were like, he's a raving lunatic. He's going to destroy everything. And like, what are they talking about? I mean, so that's when I sort of became clued into the fact that the national media, what's now known as the mainstream media, had a very liberal political bias. And I could see it just as clear as day during the time after the Republicans won the election and when they actually took office in 95. So as a Republican Congress, though, they were able to force President Clinton to do two things that Clinton really didn't want to do. One is balance the budget, and two is to put through massive welfare reform. Clinton, in his re-election in 96, took credit for these things and said, hey, I balanced the budget and I got welfare reform. But the fact is, he didn't want to do it. I remember he resisted. They said, we're going to balance the budget within 7 years. He said, let's say 10 years. They said, no, 7 years. And he said, okay, I guess so. And they said, we're going to limit the amount of time someone can spend on welfare. He said, I don't think that's a good idea. They said, yes, we're going to do it. So they forced him. So the short story is, Clinton ran as a middle-of-the-road moderate, but then he began governing as a left-wing radical, which is probably what he really is. But then the Republicans forced him to then move back to the center, and it was his move back to the center that got him reelected in 96 because of these things like the balanced budget and the welfare reform. So in 96, Clinton was reelected. I don't need to show you that. He won a pretty good reelection. Ross Perot did run again and didn't do as well as he did in 92, but he still got a lot of votes. Okay, Summer Olympics, 1996. Atlanta hosted the Summer Olympics. And for the most part, it was a very positive thing for America. People felt good about it. People liked the Olympics. We had a very successful showing. It probably contributed to the good patriotic feelings that helped President Clinton get reelected. In 84, by the way, 84, we hosted the Los Angeles Summer Olympics, and then in the fall, Reagan got reelected. In 96, we hosted the Atlanta Olympics, and then in the fall, Clinton got reelected. And there's a connection between the Olympics. Everybody watches the Olympics. Everybody feels very patriotic, especially when we do really well. And we won both of those Olympic Games pretty overwhelmingly. And so that helps the sitting president because when people feel good about the country, they're more likely to reelect the sitting president. So, but outside of the games themselves, there was an interesting thing that happened, and that is that there was a bomb, a backpack bomb, found in the Olympic Park. And Richard Jewell was the security guard who discovered this bomb and reported it to the police. Well, then the police turned on him as a suspect, and then the media found out that he was a suspect, and the media turned on him. And by the end of '96, they had convinced everybody in America that Richard Jewell was the Olympic Park bomber. They just couldn't get enough evidence to convict him. And to this day, if you ask the average American, sort of my age, about the Olympic Park bombing, the name that they associate with it is Richard Jewell, who was innocent. So last year, Clint Eastwood made a movie called Richard Jewell in which he exposed how unfair it was for the FBI and the media to target Richard Jewell and basically destroy his life, when really he was the hero. He found the bomb and saved many, many people's lives. He should have had, he should have gotten a medal and a key to the city and a parade. Instead, he got accused, and it was terrible. Now, the guy who actually did it is the picture you see on the screen, Eric Rudolph. And they caught him because in 1997, he bombed 2 abortion clinics, one in Atlanta, one in Birmingham, and he also bombed a lesbian nightclub. Now, that should tell you that Eric Rudolph was a right-wing domestic terrorist. So again, if you ever hear this talk about the concern about right-wing domestic terrorists, this is not without basis. This is not completely just a left-wing crazy people talking because they hate conservatives. Timothy McVeigh, Eric Rudolph were right-wing extremists who carried out bombings, who did acts of domestic terrorism in the 1990s. So Eric Rudolph was convicted and he was given a consecutive life sentence for each of the 4 bombings, the Olympic Park, the 2 abortion clinics, and the lesbian nightclub. So he is currently serving 4 consecutive life sentences for those bombings. All right, last thing we're going to talk about today happened in 98 to 99, and that is that Bill Clinton was impeached by the House of Representatives and then put on trial in the Senate. So in the 98 midterms, so Clinton was reelected in 96, and then in 98 there's midterm elections. So in the 98 midterms, Republicans won even stronger majorities in both houses. They controlled both houses of Congress, the representatives and the Senate. And so they impeached President Clinton for perjury to a grand jury and obstruction of justice. So this goes back to a man named Kenneth Starr was the independent counsel investigator. He was kind of the Robert Mueller of the 90s, Kenneth Starr. He investigated Clinton, and the initial point of investigation was something called Whitewater. It was a series of land deals in Arkansas that looked crooked and corrupt, and it looked like the Clintons had gotten off with, illegally profiteering off of their office. Well, they didn't find anything in Whitewater that would convict the Clintons. And they did find one thing, and that is that Paula Jones had come forward and had testified that Bill Clinton had sexually harassed her and assaulted her. And in her trial, where she was suing him for sexual harassment and assault, Clinton was asked to give testimony to the grand jury for this trial, and he was asked about a bunch of different things, including he was asked about his relationship with a White House intern, Monica Lewinsky. And he said under oath that he did not have a sexual relationship with Monica Lewinsky. And the way he said it is, there is no sexual relationship between me and the White House intern, Monica Lewinsky. So he said there is no sexual relationship between me and the White House intern, Monica Lewinsky. Well, later, physical evidence was found in the form of a stained blue dress, which had certain stains on it from the president that was tested, and it was identified as being the president's. And that was used as the piece of evidence to basically prove that Bill Clinton did have a sexual relationship. And then he was asked about it on television. Did you lie under oath? And this is where the famous line comes up where he says, well, I didn't really lie under oath. And they said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, it depends on what the meaning of the word is. So that's where that line comes in. You might have heard it. It depends on what the meaning of the word is. And what he means by that is what he said under oath is there is no sexual relationship between me and Monica Lewinsky, because in his mind, he had ended the relationship, so it was in the past. There was, but there wasn't an is. So he said on the news, it depends on what the meaning of the word is, which everybody knew he was just being, this is where he gets his name, Slick Willie. I don't know if you've heard that nickname for Bill Clinton, but he was known as Slick Willie because of these sort of lawyer tactics of sort of dodging the point by very carefully constructing his words so as to be technically correct while also lying. So he was, because of that, he was accused of perjury to that grand jury because of that investigation. Again, it was not the fact, again, a lot of people misunderstand what was going on here, and they say Clinton was put on trial for having an affair with Monica Lewinsky in the White House. No. He was not put on trial for having an affair with Monica Lewinsky in the White House, which was inappropriate for the President of the United States to be having an affair with a 19, 20-year-old White House intern. Totally inappropriate, obviously. That's more than just an affair. That's, not good. But what he was actually put on trial for was the fact that in the Paula Jones case, where Paula Jones was trying to sue him for sexual harassment and assault, was trying to establish that this was a pattern of behavior for Clinton, Clinton lied under oath and obstructed justice. So he obstructed justice for Paula Jones, and he lied under oath. So the U.S. House of Representatives impeached him on two accounts, two impeachment accounts. There were actually more than that, but the two big ones were perjury to a grand jury and obstruction of justice. That was in December 19th of 1998. Beth and I had been married for 6 months. I was 24 years old, just to let you know where I was in my life. This went to the Senate for trial, which ended in February of 99. So it's very interesting, the timing here, because, the recent impeachment of President Trump, also the impeachment, handed down in December, and then the trial happened in the early 2000. So 98 to 99, just like Trump's was 2019 to 2020. So there was a 21-day trial in the Senate. It ended on February 12th, 1999. 55 senators voted that he was guilty of perjury, which was a majority vote that he was guilty of perjury. However, that was not enough to convict him, because you need a 2/3 vote to remove the president. So it was far short of the 67 votes that would be needed. However, it was more guilty votes than President Trump got, 5 more, I think, than President Trump got in his trial. 55 said he was guilty, 45 said he was not guilty, and then on the obstruction of justice charge, it was a 50-50 split. Now later, in January of 2001, after he was out of office, Clinton's law license was suspended by the state of Arkansas for 5 years when he admitted to them that he had basically obstructed justice during this trial. So he later admitted that he was guilty of this, and his law license was suspended for 5 years. Something that a lot of people don't talk about, which I remember very well, this little dirty thing that happened during this impeachment process, was right around the time that the U.S. House was voting to impeach and it was being sent to the Senate. Larry Flynt, who's a very famous and very wealthy pornography maker, he came out and he had evidence of adulterous relationships by the incoming Republican Speaker of the House. So he came out and he said, hey, this incoming Republican Speaker of the House, he's not all holy and mighty. He's been guilty of adulterous relationships in the past. And then he offered $1 million to anyone who had evidence of adulterous relationships from anyone, any Republican in the Senate, or anyone in the Senate, I think. This really was very bizarre, but also very powerful. And many people think that this is what actually silenced many of the senators and was influential in tipping the scales and not having Clinton removed from office. So anyway, that was in 99. So that kind of brings us to the end of the 90s. And that's the 90s. So next time we're going to talk about the 2000s. I did put some videos on Schoology about President George H.W. Bush and about President Clinton and some things related to that. So you need to watch those, please. And next week we're going to talk about the 2000s, including 9/11. We'll spend a considerable amount of time on 9/11 and the second Gulf War and the war in Afghanistan and things like that next time when we talk about the 2000s. So that's all I have for you today. And I hope you have a great day. And I hope that you read your chapter in your book and study, because remember, you will have a unit test on this last unit at the end of our course together. Let's pray. Shall we? Father in heaven, thank you for this time that we've had together as a class. Thank you for these students. I pray that you would help them as they read and as they think and as they watch these videos, as they process the things we went over today, that you would help them to really absorb this material and to understand it and to be more faithful ambassadors for you in the world that our history has brought us to by your hand. We pray this, Father, in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, guys, I will see you next week. Bye.